on this episode of AK Podcast.
I've seen what not properly raising calves and heifers can do to the long-term productivity of an operation. I've been blessed that a number of the operations I worked with globally, I worked with over and over again. So it was not just like a one and done sort of visit. A lot of the things we were working on was just kind of back to basics and, keeping it simple and protocol drift kind of stuff. And that can really move the needle. And I've been blessed to see it happen, right? So, just knowing that we can make a difference and we can do small things in the first uh, months of the animal's life, and in some cases, the first hours of the animal's life, that'll carry through the rest of her life. That's where it lands for me.
You know you're a hay nerd when you walk into a hay barn and you just love that smell.
Doggone it, I gotta put more corn in. I'm gonna have to add some soybean meal. Wow, did that cost you a lot of money?
Put yourself in a crowded elevator, and the elevator stops because, I don't know, the building's on fire.
I really like to ask them what's important to them.
We're here for the cow. She's giving us all the profits we need to maintain these facilities and buildings and employees. Man, let's take care of her.
Roadway, I'd call it more as a roundabout.
And it's kind of like a weird analogy where we're, as farmers, farming and raising these livestock up, and then themselves are kind of have their own, herd of microbes in their gut that they're raising up.
I have two great passions in my life. The one is people, and the second is cows. And I want to get the best out of them.
Hello, and welcome to AK Podcast, where we explore science and nutrition behind livestock care and management with the best and the brightest in the business. I'm your host, Chris Radke, part of the sales department here at Agri-King, and with me today is the Director of Field Services and a member of the sales marketing team, Mr. Mike Donaldson. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Outstanding, Chris. How's your world been turning?
Well, it's pretty good. We're cooling down, and right now, it's Halloween. So my kids are either going to get excited or jittery because of all the sugars or whether they're going to dress up as. So it's a great time.
Good.
Mike, who's with us and what are we talking about today?
Well, a lot of animal agriculture needs to be focused on the future, Chris. We got important things to take care of today, but we also do some things today that we don't see the payback from until distant time. That is really true in calf and heifer programs. They're not only a huge investment today, but that's the farm's future. And we're increasingly learning that there's things that can go wrong in an early calf or heifer's life that will limit their potential 2, 3, 5 years from now. So it becomes really important that we're getting this taken care of correctly. Our guest today is Agri-King nutrition consultant, Dr. Adam Geiger. Adam, welcome to the podcast. Could you give us a little bit of your background and what makes you so passionate about dairy nutrition in total, along with your emphasis on calves and heifers?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so background is a bit of a loaded question. Did a bit of moving around, but so I was born on a dairy just outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Pretty typical Wisconsin kid. We sent all of our milk for cheese production, and we are 20 minutes south of Lambeau Field is where our dairy was. So go Packers. And then I did an undergraduate degree in dairy science at University of Wisconsin. Did a master's in ruminant nutrition with focus on transition cows and calf and heifer nutrition at Mississippi State. And then I actually did a PhD in lactation physiology at Virginia Tech. And our program there was really focused on how feeding the young animal impacts her future development and her milk producing capacity. And then I did some milk replacer and calf starter formulations for a little while for a feed company here in the States, and then jumped over to a company called Zinpro. I was there for about 9 years. And what I did there mostly was international tech support. I was on dairies in 61 different countries in 9 years. And most of that was focused on calf and heifer support. And then as of August 1, started my role here with Agri-King and still really involved in the calf and heifer space. I mean, my passion started because when I was a kid, that's all I knew, right? Number one, it paid the bills. But number two, it's my dad was a dairyman, right? And he was my hero. So that's where it started. I was the third generation on the farm. And then, through my travel experiences abroad, I've seen a lot of things go wrong. And I've seen what not properly raising calves and heifers can do to the long-term productivity of an operation. I've been blessed that a number of the operations I worked with globally, I worked with over and over again. So it was not just like a one and done sort of visit. A lot of the things we were working on was just kind of back to basics and, keeping it simple and protocol drift kind of stuff. And that can really move the needle. And I've been blessed to see it happen, right? So, just knowing that we can make a difference and we can do small things in the first months of the animal's life, and in some cases, the first hours of the animal's life, that'll carry through the rest of her life. That's where it lands for me.
That's perfect. And we are very glad to have you at Agri-King. Today's podcast is going to start. We've convinced Adam to do a 4-part series with us. So today we're going to talk about a calf's first 48 hours of life. Part 2, we'll talk about wet calves. Part 3 will take care of the time between a calf being weaned and when they're a pregnant heifer, check pregnant. And in part 4, we'll finish things off by going from that heifer being checked pregnant up until she calves. And you made an observation that I'd actually thought of over the week, thinking of doing this, especially on quote unquote smaller farms. Often it's a kid who takes care of calves. And I know when I was a kid, that was, my brothers and sister and I, that was one of our jobs, was to feed calves. And I don't think we really did a terrible job, but I'm not sure that a 12 or 13-year-old should really be in charge of something that's worth $1,000 today. But it was all we were strong enough to do. It became an easy way to help out. And I'm sure there's still a fair amount of that. Calf raising, even if they're not worth $1,000 when they hit the ground, I think there's probably been more change in how we look at baby calves and heifers in the last 15 or 20 years than any other single part of an animal's life, just because we realize it's more important. There's things bigger than just keeping them alive. And that's where I think you do a good job of taking us through that. So let's start. Give us a rundown. We say the first 48 hours of their life. You may want to even back that up to the last period of time they're still in their mother. But start us out. What are you looking to have taken care of in that time?
Yeah, the first 48, I may have led you a bit astray on that one because, people always think about the calf and, okay, the moment it hits the ground or the moment the birthing process starts, right, what am I going to do to get this thing right? And the truth of the matter, as we've talked before, right, we can really screw it up before that pretty well, particularly with that last trimester of pregnancy. And so really what we're focused there, right, is that fetus is developing. Body weight growth of the fetus is faster there than it is in any other part of the pregnancy. And that calf is using a lot of nutrients from mom. And so really what we focus on is kind of those trace element availability to the calf, vitamins, macrominerals, microminerals. Certainly a big one we need to keep an eye on is making sure that these cows are fed enough metabolizable protein at the end of their pregnancy, because that will be important for not only calf growth, but also colostrum production for that cow. If she doesn't get enough protein, she won't make enough colostrum. And then making sure that she's getting the minerals and the vitamins. And I bring that one up specifically because that's typically the biggest issue I see on farm. And no fault to really the producer or the nutritionist a lot of times, because we'll look at these diets on paper and they look pretty good, right? We're meeting all the animal's needs as defined by the NRC or the NASEM. But here's my big takeaway for that period. Test your water, right? A lot of time the water that these far off and close-up cows are drinking is loaded with antagonists, right? And the number one thing I typically see is sky-high levels of iron. Right? If you've got sky high levels of iron in your water, it's actually going to bind a lot of the elements in your diets. and then they're not going to be absorbed by the cow, which means they're not available to the calf. And I've seen that in a lot of places actually lead to birth abnormalities and birth defects. So takeaway number one, test your water. I recommend doing it twice a year, fall and spring, because a lot of folks don't realize that as your water table changes and we get more or less precipitation seasonally, what is actually in our water is going to change too. Things will become more or less concentrated.
Now
So
that's a
where I
good
start.
point. Very good point. Anything else in that before they hit the ground period to be paying attention to? I mean, I guess where I'll be blunt. What environment would you like that calf to come into the world in?
Yep, that's the next step, right? Is making sure the environment that the calf is born into is clean, right? The last thing we want is that calf's first meal to be a mouthful of mud or manure, right? So we need to be prepared for the birthing process. We need to have people going through that close-up or that maternity area regularly checking for signs of labor. They need to understand what those signs of labor look like. They need to make sure that there's an area that is dry, preferably draft-free, right? That is well bedded so that that calf is born into an environment where it's not going to become contaminated the moment it's born, right? So making sure we're feeding these animals well and making sure that the environment is well prepared and that we have employees that know how to check for signs of labor and know how to check for signs of birthing difficulties so they know when to intervene. Not intervening too soon, but intervening if needed to help that calf be born. And then once that calf is born, it obviously needs to be born into a clean environment. And then that's when we start the steps. That's when the first 48 hours really begin, right?
Well, then that's the perfect jumping off point. We've kind of had a preamble. We've got some things covered beforehand. We've had a prelude, like a good Broadway play. We've got the orchestra playing a little bit. You've heard all the songs. You know what's supposed to happen. Now let's start with calf on the ground. What do you want me to do?
Okay, right. So everybody, first thing they think of is colostrum, right? And I promise you we're headed there. But because colostrum can take up a lot of time and it ends up being an area of a lot of focus and questions, there's a couple other things that I like to bring up first, right? So number one, make sure that you, well, in terms of colostrum, make sure you have a plan, right? Because you're going to need that to be pretty well coordinated. So once we get there talking about colostrum, you should have a detailed plan that when the time comes, you're ready for it, right? Number one, remove the calf from the cow, right? The data shows that the longer the calf is with the cow, I mean, death loss just skyrockets. So we want that calf out of there as quickly as possible. Number two, we should clean off that calf somehow, right? So I like to have towels or something around that we can clean that calf off. That actual rubbing motion of the calf has a number of really potent benefits. Number one of which is it improves blood circulation, which is going to help that animal start to maintain its body temperature. It's going to help with absorption of nutrients, things like that. So when we start to feed colostrum, that's going to make a big difference. Number three, get a weight on it. You know, I feel like that's how do we analyze our, and we're going to talk about this in the next session a lot, right? Calf growth, things like that. How do we improve things if we don't even know what the heck we got? Right. So I always say, grab that weight so you at least know what your birth weight is. And then we can get a weight when she leaves the hutch later on. And then we have benchmarks to work at. But the next one, and this is one that unfortunately I've been seeing a lot of issues with globally, and it's really been picking up, is dip that dang navel. I'm seeing so many issues globally with navel infections. It's really ramping up. Okay. And there's two big reasons for that. Number one is guys here, when you hear, I need to dip the navel, what do you think of? What are you thinking about dipping with?
Iodine.
Iodine is typically it, right? So what do guys think? Well, I've got plenty of that in the parlor. Let's just bring her out there and start dipping, right?
Oh, we're using teat dip to get.
Yes.
Okay. Very good point. Hadn't thought of that.
But that's not what we should be doing, right? We need to be using a 7% tincture of iodine. And what's the tincture? It's alcohol. Why do we need alcohol in there? To dry out the navel, right? So if we're just using iodine, and we're not including the alcohol, we don't dry out the navel. And then, especially as operations get bigger, a lot of guys use spray bottles because they don't actually have to climb in the hutch or in with the calf. So you don't get full 360-degree
They
coverage.
can do it from a distance. Okay,
Yep.
okay.
So you don't get full 360-degree coverage. So I've got a lot of guys where we've just had to go back to, hey, you dip these things immediately, and I want them checked twice within the first 10 days. Just come through and palpate every calf, feel for heat, feel for an enlarged navel. That's becoming a really big problem. And my counterpart Cameron and I were dealing with navel infection issues all over the place. It's really weird.
Now, what would be, now you're making me curious. So let's say that a couple of days after an animal's born, I go through, I'm palpating that navel area, and I feel a little bit of heat. Maybe the calf's ears aren't quite where they ought to be. Just the signs the signs of good husbandry you have to pay attention to. So what's your instructions for me to do on that calf where I'm seeing the navel's not right?
Yep. Well, first dip it again. That's your first one. And obviously you need to make sure when you dip it the first time, I left this out, make sure it's clean when you dip it, right? So make sure it's clean again, and then dip it. And then you're going to want to work with your veterinarian to, you're likely going to be looking at a treatment, and it's likely going to be penicillin, but work with your veterinarian on that. I am not a veterinarian, so certainly on a podcast, I don't want to make any recommendations, but we talk about it with the vets and come up with an action plan for what they should do based off the severity and things like that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. And then that brings us to colostrum. Right. So this could be, when I used to teach at the university, we would do 2 1-hour sessions on colostrum, right? So you can really get deep in the weeds, and that's not the intention of today. But I published an article in Journal of Animal Science before COVID, and we published this figure. And this figure we called the 5 Qs of colostrum management, right? So I say colostrum management is not rocket science. There's 5 things. And if you can evaluate these 5 things, typically, if I've got an issue with colostrum, it's one of those. So if you can evaluate those 5 things, 9 times out of 10, you're going to find your issue, right? And the first one is not something you can change, right? The first one we call is quantifying, right? And that's testing the blood to see if you provided adequate amounts of colostrum. So this first Q is like our checkup at the end. If that Q is off, there's nothing you can do, right? So you need to go look at the other Qs. But let's talk about what quantifying means, right? So when you're on a dairy, colostrum gets fed, right? And then you're going to want to take a blood sample from the jugular 24 to 48 hours after you fed it. Okay, don't go past 48 because then the numbers become pretty unreliable. Don't go earlier than 24 because colostrum absorption is probably not finished, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we test the blood, what are we looking for? We're looking for IgG, immunoglobulins, antibodies, call it whatever you want, right? So the calf is born without an immune system, right? She has no way to fight disease. So where does she get that immune system from? Colostrum, right? And what does mom do at the end of her pregnancy? Well, mom's encountered diseases her entire life. So she puts antibodies specific to those diseases in her colostrum. The calf consumes the colostrum. The colostrum's absorbed, right? And for the first 3 to 4 weeks, those antibodies, or those IgG in the colostrum, provide the calf with an immune system. We call it passive immunity, right? Mom passed it to baby. So she has protection for the first 3 to 4 weeks. During those first 3 to 4 weeks, then she's going to start encountering pathogens in the hutch, in the maternity area, wherever. And then her immune system gets smart and starts to learn. So her own immune system starts to come into play. And we call that active immune system, right? She's actively learning from her environment, right? So when we test at 24 hours, we're testing to make sure that immunity was passed on from mom to baby. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're looking for the blood, we're looking for IgG. we're looking for at least 10 grams of IgG per liter of serum. But unfortunately, we can't test that on farm because it's something you'd have to send off to a lab. It's expensive. It takes time. So instead, we use a refractometer. And I've got one right here, right? This is a Brix refractometer, right? So you're going to put a little serum sample, right? You've got to get the serum separated from the blood. You're going to put it on this baby. This thing is going to measure serum total protein, and the number we're typically looking for is at least 5.5 grams per deciliter. Okay, that equals the 10, right? So this is how we can estimate it on farm. Okay, so the first thing the first cue we're looking at, and I spend a lot of time on this because it's important. The other ones will be a little more straightforward, is testing the serum to make sure we're actually achieving passive immunity. If we are not, that's when we evaluate the other 4 cues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just because I'm sure we're going to get some questions, all it takes to do this is the refractometer and then some aspect of a centrifuge to separate. How are you separating the blood?
You can just leave it out at room temperature and it'll separate enough over about 24 hours, right? And then you can and then you're going to need either like a syringe or you can buy plastic transfer pipettes off Amazon, and all you need is 2 drops on this thing. If you look in there, right? This is kind of the Cadillac system because I use it a lot. This one's about probably $400, but I mean, you nailed it on the head. These calves are worth $1,000, $1,400. You save one, this thing's paid for itself, right? So
yeah,
I wouldn't. And, it's pretty sturdy. It's going to last you a while.
Yeah. Oh, great. That's great. Thanks for completing the equipment list. That's great.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, okay. So say you've got a number of calves that are popping below a 5.5. The next question is, okay, now, what do I look at, right? Something's wrong here, right? And so that's where we go into the next 4 cues. All right. And so our first cue, right, and we're talking about maternal colostrum, is quality, right? How high of quality colostrum am I feeding? Colostrum quality is measured in terms of grams per liter. Okay. Just like the serum was, grams per liter of IgG. The number we're looking at is 50 grams of IgG per liter. But we can't measure it on farm, can we? Because you can't measure IgG. So how do we measure it? Well, there's 2 ways we can measure it. The number one way is the most common way I'd say in the past was, you ever heard of a colostrometer? Yeah, those plastic tubes with that glass apparatus that drops down.
Mm-hmm.
That's better than nothing, but it's temperature sensitive. So if it's super hot or super cold, it could give you an incorrect answer. And number 2, those things are pretty dang fragile. I think I've ripped through about 7 in my life. So, you can use them, but they can be a pain in the neck. So what can we use instead? This guy, right?
Right.
The Brix refractometer.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. And so there's a setting on here. The setting we talked about last time was total protein. Now we're talking about an actual Brix setting in here. Good quality colostrum should have a Brix value of over 23. So 23 equals 50. All right. So we can use this guy again, right? And that's why now you're talking about $400. I've got 2 uses for it. So last time we're going to talk about this thing, but it can also measure milk solids, and we'll talk about that next time.
So
dry matter.
And in this case, where the blood that you pulled from the calf needed a degree of preparation, this is just a couple drops of colostrum out of whatever you put it in and into the refractometer, right?
Exactly. No prep needed.
Okay, perfect.
So that's our first one. We got to make sure the colostrum that we're dealing with is of good quality, right? So it pays to have a frozen bank of colostrum if we can on farm, in case an animal doesn't have good quality colostrum, right? There's a lot of things that can impact it. The quality of colostrum, dry period length, too long or too short, the level of stress, if we're seeing issues with dry matter intake in these cows, heat stress, cold stress, things like that, vaccination protocol, animals that are destined to get a transition disorder will have worse colostrum. And of course, the number one thing that people say is nutrition, right? Everybody thinks that nutrition really has a massive impact. Uh, and that's actually a bit of a myth. Um, if your nutritionist is doing a good job, has had access to all of your feedstuffs, macros, micros, bad nutrition can certainly hurt colostrum, but if your nutritionist is doing a good job, there's not much more we can do beyond that nutritionally to influence colostrum. Which then brings us to our next cue is quantity, right? How much of this stuff do I feed? So if you went and asked a producer you work with, how much colostrum are you feeding? What are they going to tell you?
I mean, the rank and file, someone average, probably a bottle, 2 quarts.
Okay, yeah, or a gallon, right?
Yeah,
that would be the two.
2 to 4, 1 bottle or 2.
So here's a question for you: if I feed a gallon of a bricks of 10, am I going to get passive transfer? No.
Okay.
Calves do not have a requirement for volume of colostrum, right? They have a requirement for grams of IgG. I could feed 50 liters, 10 gallons of the poorest quality colostrum I can find. That calf isn't going to get passive immunity, right? So typically the common recommendation is a gallon or 4 liters. And where that comes from is if you've got 50 grams of IgG per liter, right, and you feed, a gallon, you're going to be getting 150 to 200 grams minimum IgG into those calves. And that's what the calf needs, at least 150 grams of IgG, right? So if we assume a liter and a quart are pretty similar because the measurement is always in grams per liter, right? If your colostrum tests at 50 grams per liter, you need about 3 quarts, right? Right. If it tests at 75 grams per liter, so maybe a bricks of like 25, 26, 27, you probably only need 2 quarts. But that's assuming everything else is perfect, right? So that's where the quality and quantity work together, right? If we're getting 50 grams of IgG per liter or a 23 in the bricks, if we feed a gallon, we should be covered if everything else is well handled.
Okay. That I never thought of it. I never thought it's completely common sense, but I never thought of quality affecting the needed quantity that way.
Yeah. It's really, again, it's not a volume requirement, right? That's what we're trying to get people to realize. But I mentioned everything else has to be perfect, right? And that's where our 2 other cues come into play. All right. Our first cue is quickness.
I was waiting for that. I thought that part had to come up. Yeah. I thought that had to be coming here, but I couldn't figure out how to make when you fed it into a cue. So go ahead.
Yep. Quickness. There you go. And so this one actually has 2 parts to it. One affects the cow, one affects the calf, right? So the first part of that cue is how quickly you milk the cow post freshening. We like to see that happen within 4 hours. Because there's good data that shows if you wait till 6 hours fresh, colostrum quality drops by about 20%. Okay. Now that once you test it, then right? So once you've tested it with the bricks, then you obviously know. So that's one to keep in mind. If our colostrum quality is overall pretty low, maybe we need to, speed up how we're getting fresh cows milked, which can be an issue for when animals are born at night. But the other part of this quickness cue is how quickly we feed the calf. I want to see calves fed within 2 hours of birth. And again, can be a challenge for calves born at night. And the reason we say 2 hours is because by 4 hours of age, the ability to absorb colostrum is going to decrease by 20 to 30%.
I've always heard that.
So that's where it gets really dangerous. If you're trying to feed calves colostrum from their own dam, she's born at night, you don't milk the cow till she's 6-8 hours fresh, and then you feed the calf and she's 6-8 hours old. Now you're feeding her a lower quality colostrum meal that she can absorb less of it, right? And that's where this can get pretty hairy, right? So that's why having that frozen bank of colostrum or even a colostrum replacer around is a really good tool to help you get things into these calves quickly.
Okay. Perfect. Now you got me hanging on. What's the 5th?
All right. Well, this one was this one really, I'm taking open suggestions for what this cue is because it's this one's a little more artistic. So for a while it was squeaky clean, and I would underline the Q after the S. But
Okay.
I actually had a buddy of mine in the past say, "Why don't you just call it quite clean?" So that's what we're going with now. But really, what we're looking at is bacterial contamination. Okay, and so we want to see bacterial load in colostrum be a total plate count of less than 50,000 colony forming units per mil and
Okay.
coliform count of less than 10,000 CFUs per mil. Okay. And we can test that in the actual colostrum by having it sent to, the milk plant where we ship our milk. A lot of times they'll test that. But so here's another question for you. Where does, bacteria in colostrum, where does most of that come from?
From the udder, the teats, it could be what you're milking her into. There'd be a lot of places it could come from, I guess.
Yeah. So the first one that people typically say is, from the cow, and so that's why we want to pull calves, right? Because if the cow's not prepped in the parlor, certainly there's going to be some bacterial contamination there. But if we do a good job of preparing the udder, typically that's not a big issue. But there's two big areas where bacterial contamination comes from. Number one is storage.
Oh, okay.
If you let colostrum sit at room temperature, even while you're waiting to freeze it or whatever, bacteria doubles every 20 minutes. So even if you pasteurize it, right, pasteurization isn't sterilization, and it's got a low level of bacteria, and then you let it sit for a while, it's just doubling. It can spiral really quickly. So if you're not going to feed it within a couple of hours, freeze it, right?
Okay.
So that's number one. Number two is the equipment that it comes in contact with. And this is the thing that I focus on a lot globally. So I've got this other piece of equipment, right? This is my bacteria meter. It's called an ATP meter. It's measuring the ATP in bacterial cells and telling you contamination load. So I'll use this on, and this is actually developed for human use, right? So it's used in like milk and meat plants to see if the things that we are using to prepare our own food for human consumption is appropriate. And so the number I'm looking for on this guy when I'm on a farm evaluating things is a bacteria load of less than 20,000, right, on feeding equipment. Okay.
Okay.
And so this thing comes with a swab, right? And so I know it's kind of hard over a podcast to see it, but there's an enzyme in here that I'll just show you. Let's just pretend my phone is a thing of this is the swab here. Just pretend my phone is a piece. Let's call it a bottle, right? So this thing right now is picking up bacteria, and what's going to happen is once I've picked up this bacteria, we're going to put this thing back in here, and it's going to coat the swab with an enzyme. And then when I put it in this machine, it's going to light it up, and you won't be able to see the number. So you're just going to have to trust me that I'm not sugarcoating it and telling you the truth, right? But remember, we want less than 20,000. Okay. And so if I run it, right, the nice thing about this, it won't tell you what type of bacteria it is, but it's going to give you a result really quickly. Okay. So I'm not sugarcoating it, right? My phone was 400,000. So don't tell my wife. But if I'm on a farm and I see something at 400,000, I'm going to start asking questions, right? I'm not throwing things out yet, but it's like, hey, was this clean this morning? Explain to me your cleaning protocol, things like that. Because I'll tell you, there's this one farm I work with overseas that I've been to a number of times. And I went in and I swabbed the bucket that all of the colostrum was milked into. And I mean, it looked clean and it smelled clean. It had a bacteria reading of 38 million. It's the highest I ever saw. And I kid you not, this farm was losing 1 out of every 5 calves before 60 days of age. And so the first thing we did was we lit that pail on fire and got them a different one. But we had to also burn their protocols to the ground, right? We had to bring in new cleaning equipment, call up manufacturers and making sure we were adhering to temperature and contact times for our cleaning agents. But the number one thing that we can typically do that moves the needle the most?
What's that?
Install drying racks. right? The most important part of the cleaning process is drying. That's the only thing that really effectively breaks the bacteria's growth cycle. So a lot of times, when I see something 400,000, that's what I'm going to ask is, okay, what are you using for a cleaning agent? And are you actually using a brush to put in some elbow grease? And then how are we getting things dry? Because if we're not getting things dry, that's typically a pretty big culprit, right? And I kid you not, this thing saved more calves' lives than I ever have. And, to me, bacteria is the number one killer of calves globally. And that's what it comes down to. So a lot of times when I'm on farms, what I'm doing is these cleaning audits. And we're saving a lot of calves' lives, and we're really moving the needle by focusing on that cue.
I'm going to say we may not be through the first 48 hours, but I think having covered the 5 cues becomes a really good stopping point for today, because we have the ability to pick this up wherever we want on our next chapter. And if we wind up going 5 chapters instead of 4, that's going to be a fine thing. But I almost recommended before we started that people go get something to take notes on, because I've heard Adam speak. I knew there was going to be a lot of really good information. Well, this is a good spot to stop, go back, review this. You could be kind, rewind, and just for VHS tapes, review some of this information, get these 5 cues answered. We'll put a mark on Adam's notes and look to pick this up on our next episode at the rest of the 48 hours. So I'm sure we're not through that whole 2 days, but I think this is a wonderful place to stop.
Yeah, and really we could call this the first 24 hours. And this covers the main points that I do like to get through, right? And so if we just kind of review some of the big takeaways, right, that I would, if people have just grabbed their notebooks and they want to write these down, I'll make life easy for them. Still go back and listen. But test that water, right? Make sure, especially if you're seeing issues with calves right after birth, just make sure there's nothing there that's causing problems. Number 2, dip navels. 7% tincture of iodine. Check them twice within the first 10 days. Okay. And then colostrum. If you're not testing colostrum quality right now, that is the number one thing you can do to benchmark your colostrum program and figure out where things are at. And the 4th thing I would say is keep things clean, right? So if you can do those 4 things, test your water, dip navels, test colostrum quality, and keep things clean, I mean, those are 4 huge drivers for success in the first 24 to 48 hours.
That is perfect. That is perfect. Well, I hope people came away with today having picked up some good advice. And I can't imagine it hasn't whet people's appetite for what you've got next. So I guess this is a little bit like the movie trilogies where you watch the first one and get hooked in to watch the whole rest of them. So thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Geiger. Really, really appreciate your time. Chris, what'd you learn today?
Hey, I learned who Adam was, so I love that. I'm just going to say, I was going to say some of the things Adam said, but my big takeaway, I'm going to just say the 5 Qs. I love that, just like breaking that down. So colostrum management, quantify, quality, quantity, quickness, and he said originally squeaky clean, but quite clean. I love just the simpleness of the way you broke that down, and I love your knowledge and how you're sharing that with. So thanks for sharing your story, Adam. Love it, love it. If you like what you heard and you'd like to hear more, you can email us at podcast@agriking.com. You can find us on majority of the social medias. And if you'd like to hear more, just connect with us there. All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
You bet.